Chinese ambassador to the UK has rebuked comments from the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary after they expressed their support for protesters in Hong Kong. After China asserted that Britain should not interfere with the affairs of its former colony, why does the UK feel it should play such a strong role when there is no legal pretext to do so? And with over 100 US academics and public figures penning an open letter to US President Donald Trump advising him to reconsider his China policy, what effect, if any, will it have on future relations between China and the United States? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The Chinese ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming, gave a televised presser on Wednesday, chastising the British government for interfering in China's internal affairs. The rare event came after UK government officials and public figures finger-pointed at the Chinese government over its Hong Kong policies and expressed support for the so-called rights of the protesters, even after some of them stormed the Hong Kong legislative complex. Liu Xiaoming said the British chose to stand on the wrong side and issued inappropriate remarks. How will these remarks impact the relationship between China and the UK? And considering the UK's past colonial rule over Hong Kong, does the UK have any role to play today? I'm joined from Hong Kong by Mr. Marvin Hung Ming Kei, member of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and Dr. Edward Xie, CEO of Gao Feng Advisory Company, a global business consultancy firm. Here in the Beijing studio, I'm joined by Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, a think tank. And we're also joined on the line by Tim Summers, Senior Consulting Fellow on the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House and a lecturer at the Center for China Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So, gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Again, I think we have to start by looking at the much-cited, much-talked-about 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, which has been quoted by many in the UK as a kind of legal pretext for them to say that the UK still has a legal responsibility. Again, we talked about it yesterday. Again, we looked at the text of this joint declaration, and I'm going to repeat what I saw here. For instance, on Article 3 and Clause number 11, the maintenance of public order in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region will be the responsibility of the government of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. And then Article 4 says that the government of the United Kingdom and the government of the People's Republic of China declare that during the transitional period between the date of the entry into force of this joint declaration and 30th June 1997, which is the date before Hong Kong was returned to Chinese sovereignty, the government of the UK will be responsible for the administration of Hong Kong. So, and for those who are not familiar with this document came into effect in May 1985. So what it actually says is that between 1985 to June 30th, 1997, it was the UK's responsibility for the administration of the Hong Kong for the Hong Kong region, but not after that. And we didn't find any clause in this law which says that the UK has a continued responsibility after the handover of Hong Kong. So Marvin, let me go to you. So do you understand on what basis are UK ministers and public figures making the claim that they still have a responsibility for Hong Kong?
I really don't understand. You know, it's a declaration. A declaration is a declaration. If this is something else, it would say something else like a binding contract. So I was 15 years old when that happened, when that was signed. So I remembered vividly, what happened. It's a declaration, enumerating the different steps and arrangement between the Chinese government and the British government to hand over Hong Kong back to China. And that's about it.
Yeah, and especially when the handover is finished, people believe that that's the mission complete, right, of that declaration. And yet, some people in the UK, for instance, quote part of the treaty which says that the current social and economic system in Hong Kong will remain unchanged, and so will the lifestyle. Some people say that this is the reason why the UK continue to have a responsibility. Dr. Gao, what is your take on whether this kind of clause can serve as the basis for the UK's claim, for some of the politicians' claim?
I think the UK's case is very much flawed, and there is no legal support in the joint declaration. And I think the British rule of Hong Kong ended midnight, June the 30th, 1997, and ever since then it's the Chinese rule over Hong Kong. China has absolute sovereignty over Hong Kong, and one country, two system principle is being practiced in Hong Kong, and there is good allocation of responsibilities between the central government in Beijing and the Hong Kong SAR government in Hong Kong. Britain has no role to play at all. Of course, as a separate country, Britain can talk about whatever they see fit in Hong Kong as in any other parts of the world. But whether they have a legal right to do so, or whether they have a legal right to, for example, interfere in the internal affairs of Hong Kong, that's absolutely not the case.
Okay, Mr. Summers, let me go to you and try to get a bit better understanding of the kind of sentiment or mentality among the British politicians and maybe part of the general public. Why, 22 years after the handover of Hong Kong, there is still this very strong feeling that it is the UK's business that Hong Kong is governed in a certain way or not?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of different points here, and this has become, I think, quite a confusing situation in the way that it's been discussed. But I don't think that British government ministers, they're certainly obviously not claiming any sovereignty or any administration over Hong Kong. I think where the idea of responsibility comes in is if the British government sees that the joint declaration has not been implemented faithfully by China, then the view of the British government seems to be that that is a point when the British government has a responsibility to speak up and to say that the joint declaration has not been implemented in the way that is set out in that agreement. So it's a rather different point about responsibility from the idea that you've been discussing, that somehow Britain has some responsibility for governing or for administering Hong Kong. And I don't think British government ministers would claim that for one moment. It's more a case of what Britain could or should do if the British government sees some contravention of the joint declaration.
So, for instance, I don't know whether you agree with their assessment. This is what they say, of course, that the rights or the freedom or the rights of the people of Hong Kong are being, not protected or not guaranteed. And yet, it is kind of ironic to me because under the British colonial rule, the Hong Kong residents had very little freedom or very little democracy, right? They had no rights. They had no rights to choose who governed the region, or they couldn't even take up very senior positions in that region. So why does UK all of a sudden feel it is their responsibility to see that Hong Kong is governed in, a complete, free and so-called democratic way? Mr. Summers, again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and it's useful to draw some of those historical parallels. I think I would differentiate between the issues of democracy and the issues of rights and freedoms more generally. I mean, it depends how far back you want to go in time, of course, but I think in the period, let's say, from the 1980s, at the very least, up to 1997, I think Hong Kong people did enjoy good rights and freedoms under British rule during that period. Of course, democracy was only just being introduced very gradually in the 1980s. So I think it's very fair to look back and say, well, that democracy was not on offer historically in Hong Kong. So I think it depends which of those issues that we're looking at. But certainly in the run-up to the handover, in the latter part of British rule over Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong was a free and open society. Actually, those freedoms have continued after 1997. I see quite a lot of continuity in that regard.
It's actually interesting that you mentioned this period between 1980 and 1997, and I would like to go to our guest, Dr. Seah, who is standing by in Hong Kong. It's a very peculiar period of time, right, because that is exactly the time when the UK sees that its colonial rule over Hong Kong is coming to an end. It kind of had no choice but to give it back to China and give it back to China's rule. So what happened to the situation? What prompted the then government of Hong Kong, the colonial government of Hong Kong, to start giving democratic rights to the people of Hong Kong?
Well, for a long time, Hong Kong was the British colony, and by definition, the British government ran Hong Kong in its usual way of running other colonies. So essentially, the British were in control of the major decisions and the policies, and they would recruit local people to be the administrator, to try to run their policies on their behalf. And with this kind of system, it could be very efficient because the Brits were making decisions and the Chinese were sort of doing the administration. But with the very clarity that by 1997, Hong Kong will be handed over to China, both the Chinese government as well as the British government were trying to manage that transition. And in that process, the British government were trying to do a number of things based on my own personal recollection. So because I'm a Hong Kong Chinese myself, I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I lived through the whole period, and I saw what happened. I think what happened was that on one hand, the British government was trying to sort of maintain a pretty laissez-free sort of free society, a free economy, and so on. At the same time, it began to open up during that transition period the idea that you Hong Kong people can begin to have some kind of political rights, which the Brits never gave to the Hong Kong people before. But over time, they begin to plant the seeds in the minds of the Hong Kong people that by 1997 or right after 1997, over time, Hong Kong people actually have that right to begin to ask for the political rights that the Brits actually never gave to Hong Kong before. So that was the major sort of happenings during that transitional period from the political standpoint. I also have to add that just one important point, that over that period of time as well, economically, the Brits were, on one hand, they were saying, the economy should be hands-free, should be a free economy, yet at the same time, actually, the Brits were very much beginning to protect or to help to protect the interests of the big businesses, especially the property developers who were rising at that time. And in fact, today, if you look at the issues with the young people in Hong Kong, it's very complicated. But I would say the root cause of that is the lack of upward mobility. The lack of upward mobility is to a large extent because of the very difficult living conditions in Hong Kong. It's becoming very expensive. That is a structural issue. That structural issue is left behind by the Brits before the 1997.
Okay, Marvin, what is your observation? What is your understanding of the situation? Do you also experienced a similar kind of change in the 1980s up to 1997 in terms of political rights that were slowly being given to the Hong Kong people? And what are the reasons behind such liberalization of political participation, let's say?
Well, I want to refer to the comment earlier about the living conditions first, and I answer the question afterwards. Well, I believe in different decades, Hong Kong have undergone a lot of challenges, pitfalls and struggles. You look at, I'm a fourth generation Honky, so my great-grandfather It took off from a fish village in Guangdong, Qiuzhou, went to Singapore and then landed in Hong Kong, I think almost 100 years ago. So, imagine the kind of challenges that he faced, and then my grandfather faced. He wasn't even fed, very well, 60, 80 years ago. So you look at the issues of upward mobilities. The overall GDP of Hong Kong has grown, by more than 100%. We've been rated the most free economy, by the Heritage Foundation. Our rule of law is great. Our innovation is good. We have an efficient government, open up, in market. So I think we need to, get back to our what we call the Lion Rock spirit. Understand, what's given to you. Grab the resources around you to be better. Yeah. And that's the spirit of Hong Kong. Okay. So Hong Kong is doing very well, and I think we can do better. Let's do that. About the process of democratization. Well, it happened so quickly. It's funny that you asked that. We in Hong Kong we're taught in one way. I know when I went to school in Hong Kong, I wasn't even taught the recent history of China. So the history that I learned in Hong Kong, stopped in Qing Dynasty. So we knew nothing about, what happened, during the First World War and Second World War. Yeah. All right. So I think around the 80s, we started, the democratization for the preparation of the 97 handover. I don't get it. Why so quick? Why are we doing it so rapidly? Why have we consulted the Chinese government, in a much better way for even a smoother transition? Okay. There were a lot of quarrels and issues that have not been resolved. Okay. And another time we can talk about that. Yeah.
Okay, we actually really don't have the time to talk about it. I'm so sorry I have to wrap it up. Many thanks to our four guests for this short but very interesting discussion. Many thanks to Marvin Hung joining us from Hong Kong, as well as Dr. Edward Sear, Victor Gao here in the Beijing studio, as well as on the line by Tim Summers joining us from Singapore. He's with Chatham House. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us.